was blown away. And look, they don't have an explanation. They may have names and labels, which is fine. They don't have an explanation for that. I have a friend who was in a bad, she was a model, in a bad accident. A big truck ran her down. By the time they got her in the hospital, I mean, her face was crushed. You had an eyeball, you know, your eyeball, have you guys had breakfast? Yeah. The eyeball had popped out. It was down, it's on a, not a string, it's on a cord. You can pop, anyway, Dolly watched the whole operation from up there in the corner. Watched him work over her, heard all the doctor's dirty jokes. When they got all done, they put her in recovery, and you know, she woke up then and they, how are you doing? She says, you really ought to learn not to tell dirty jokes in surgery. And they said, what do you mean? And she told them all the jokes, and they said, how did you know that? She says, well, I was sitting up there in the corner of the operating room. They said, no, you weren't, you were out on the table. She says, no, my body was there, I watched it, but I was up there. And we hear this happen periodically. We have no idea what's going on. Well, I do. It's called string theory and multiverses, but you have to come to my intro course for me to tease your brains about that. So anyway, these are great points. This is the problem with the law. We don't always agree with the law. For example, if death is when your heart quits beating, we know between 5 and maybe 6 weeks, you have a rudimentary circulatory system going on there. It's capable of, at some point in the future, supporting life. We also know that the same thing happens with the core brain. Between 5 and 6 weeks, rudimentary central nervous system is developing. Well, if you're dead when they quit working and we can prove that they're kind of there developing, does that mean you're alive? Well, no, because the problem with that argument was breathing doesn't start until viability, and viability these days is 20 to 22 weeks. In the old days, back with Roe, it was 33, 34, 35 weeks. So this kind of symmetry breaks down. However, 2003, we invent the supercomputer. You know the Matrix? Look at the Matrix. Yeah, they call this the Genome Project. And they now know the map of the entire human genome. And they know that a human being is comprised of 23 male and 23 female chromosomes. Now, the biologists will tell you that everything that lives on the planet reaches in the same gene pool. And this is our genetic makeup. Chimpanzees supposedly share 98.5% of our DNA. There's an interesting movie called Mission to Mars. Mission went, one survivor, big storm, da-da-da-da-da. I don't want to go into detail, but when it's all over the storm, it looks like there's like a mile-long silver face lying down with features, pointy nose. And they send another mission up there. The mission almost fails. They get down to the planet. They finally get the guy calmed down that he is being rescued. And they're trying to figure out what this stainless steel face is. And one of the guys is a technician, and he aims a radar gun at it, and you can see in this no, it's like an oscillogram. Oscilloscope, thank you. And you know, it'll do this and this, and he moderates it until he finally gets it to look like this. I'm never going to get this right. There you go. And there's two geneticists in the rescue team, and the lady geneticist says, is that DNA? And he said, about 99% of it. And the other, and she says, that's what gives us Mozart and Einstein, is that extra missing percent. And the other geneticist says, yeah, and Jack the Ripper. So you can be very close matched like chimps. I got news for you. I've been at 7 births. And talked to countless women. I never met a woman getting ready to give birth was worried about giving birth to an orangutan, a chimpanzee, a silverback. If it looks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's coming out a duck. It's coming out 23 and 23. It's the human signature. Daffodils supposedly have about 34% of our DNA, and I've heard dolphins have maybe 50% of our DNA. People have a signature now, a genetic signature, and this is it. And this differentiates us from all other life on the planet. Now there's exceptions. You have Down syndrome children that have an extra chromosome. There'll always be exceptions to the rule. But we accepted an exception to the rule when it came to personhood with the 14th Amendment. So the question morally that comes to stage now, how many of you run Windows? You still got Windows? You know, and it'll regularly say updates available. Do you want to update to the latest and greatest? And you hit the button update because you want the latest and greatest. There are lawyers right now that are trying to bring that definition to the Supreme Court and say, look, we understand in 73 you didn't know about this, but this is medical information. This is biological information. This is not tainted by religion or politics. This is just biology. Isn't it time to update the definition? And the way they're doing that is states are writing new laws, and these laws are immediately challenged by people who want to remain with the 73 definition of personhood. And then they'll go up the chain until they get to the Supreme Court. Now, the weird thing about the Supreme Court, it doesn't have to hear any case it doesn't want to. They can just stymie the whole thing and block it. And so far, they have decided not to hear any of these cases. But laws are being written. How do you write laws? You get your hand on the mechanism of the law. And whichever way you want to turn the moral compass will turn that way if you can get the courts to agree that this is a legitimate change in the law, or at least it doesn't violate the Constitution. Now, if we do update the definition, what does that do to the nature of a person? The argument is, then when that egg conceives and it gets its full complement of 23 male and 23 female, genetically that's a person. The old understanding about being born, fine, we understand that, although it didn't come out of the 14th Amendment like they claimed it did, but they accepted it, and that's the law, and it's been the law, and it remains the law. But if we update the definition, like ALS, Alzheimer, all these different things, we're constantly figuring new things out, and we present the evidence and we make adjustments so we see things according to the new evidence. But none of that has the moral implications of this. Embryonic stem cell research, abortion, euthanasia. But this is a biological fact. No one argues with the human genome. It is what it is. The moral question then is it time to update the definition of a person? That's the question. Is it time to update the definition?
I think it certainly is, but it throws a lot of other things into question.
Throws society in a turmoil. Absolutely does. And the court's aware of that. And the court's fully capable of saying, no, that would create more social discord than not, so we'll just leave things the way it is. Or the court will say, we don't want to deal with it, and until the Supreme Court deals with it.
The way I think about it is, sorry, this is hard for me to talk about. A family member of mine was pregnant with twins and ended up having a miscarriage and had to make with one of the babies and had to make the decision whether to terminate the other baby or not.
Sure.
So what happens if that law changes?
That's an excellent question. What happens if it changes? Well, here's one of the things, because they've tried to change the law. In fact, they passed it in some of the states, or they tried to, and real interesting, it was the conservative party that said no to it, and this is why. That's a great question, Carl. Real quick, there's the womb and the fallopian tube and the egg pops out of the ovary, and the sperm fertilizes it. There are things called ectopic pregnancies, where the egg never makes it down the fallopian tube into the womb. It'll embed itself in the wall of the fallopian tube, and it'll keep growing. That's just a little tube, people. And it cannot survive in there into that condition. It may well bleed the woman out if no one knows what's going on. Usually it's associated with a lot of pain. And so the law needs to make an accommodation for that, and where it doesn't, and some of these states that proposed this, they didn't make an accommodation. If I intentionally terminated that pregnancy, that would be premeditated murder, and you'd be charged with a crime. Premeditated murder. Knowing what you're doing in premeditated murder. If that law was in place, because that was a person with full moral standing. You can't take someone's life off the planet without just cause. Go ahead.
Then here's the question, though. Aren't you violating the rights of the mother?
No, of course you are.
I mean, if you're going to leave that egg in place and let that baby be born.
There you go. Welcome to court, the adversarial situation. Absolutely, people. This is what the rest of this semester is about. How weird is this stuff? The law is not always user-friendly. When it works for you, it's great. When it doesn't work for you, it's not user-friendly. We have contradictions. Right now, the law says a female who has eminent domain over her body can terminate a pregnancy without committing a crime. But if you kill a pregnant woman in a car crash, you're going to be charged with 2 homicides. To a lot of people, they go, well, isn't there a contradiction working here? Well, the law protects one and the law does not protect the other. So in this situation, the law is going to have to make a decision. If the woman wants to have it, and there are some that are out there, you know, and I'm not being critical, there are some religious people that God's will be done, and they're willing. There were women in the old days when we didn't have, all we had was, I shouldn't say all we had, surrogates to help with birthing. Many women died in childbirth. And they just accepted that. That must be God's will, or I would have had a baby and I'd be living. Serena Williams just went through that after she gave birth. She had a couple of bleed outs. What was going on? Somewhere she had say again?
She had like a tear or something.
Yeah, and she needed transfusion. There was operations to get her back on her feet again. If we hadn't had advances in medicine, she probably wouldn't be here. So we have those advances. How do we accommodate? That's the law. It's not clean and cut.
Is it a real pregnancy if it's going to result in death anyway? I mean, kind of the way I view it is if it doesn't seed properly, it's going to result in a failed pregnancy anyway. Can it really be constituted as a pregnancy?
Women, I've been in stillborn births. I watched a woman give birth to a stillborn that died in her womb. And you have to remove it. It came out, you know, grayish white, no heartbeat. And she was pregnant, or you couldn't have that happen. See, the question that you're asking is, at this stage, is it the same as in the womb? And yeah, well, the law, if this law adjudicates, says it's the same thing. It just hasn't. Look, a walnut is not a tree, right? Can it be anything but a walnut?
One day,
if it's right, it only has one choice. It cannot grow up to be a corn stalk. It cannot grow up to be a tomato. All the genetic material and coding is in there. That's where this is coming from. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, there's no other reasonable conclusion other than, given enough time, it'll be a self-aware, self-conscious, and rational duck. Hang on, go ahead. Oh, I thought you raised your hand.
No, but I was just adding to what he said. I think there's just different types of pregnancy. Like, you're still pregnant regardless. Like, you did it, you're pregnant, but you could have a miscarriage, or you would have twins, you could have just like one child. It's still pregnancy, or it's still pregnancy. There's just different types of. That's how it was going through.
Yeah, my guess is pregnancy is defined as the joining of the two, the sperm and the egg, at that point. But and that's why we break down the stages. We call it the initial fertilization, a zygote, then it grows into about 220 cells before it drops into the womb. We call that a blastocyst, a blast of cells, and then it becomes an embryo when it attaches it, and when it takes on more form, we call it a fetus. But all the while, it's the same thing. We're just changing the name. It's like waterboarding and enhanced interrogation techniques. It's the same thing. It doesn't change. Go ahead, dear.
Yeah, what else would you call it? I mean, and it's like a saying like, oh, the tree falls and nobody's there, it doesn't make a sound. Like,
Of course it makes a sound. I can prove it makes a sound. And I don't mean to be rude when I call it a critter, you know, an oven, you know, just trying to leave a little bit of room here for disagreement. Otherwise, someone will say I'm taking sides, and I try really hard not to do that in class. You got something more? No. Okay, so any questions about this? You need to know what moral standing means, how it's defined, what a person is, what death is, and the